Section 12.2b, completing the square. In this video, we're going to look at the technique of solving quadratic equations by completing the square. Now let's recall, quadratic equations are of this form: ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. In order to complete the square, two things must happen first. First, the leading coefficient, that's this a, must equal 1, and the equation must not equal 0. These two things are really easy to do. If the leading coefficient a is not 1, we can just divide it out. And in order to have the equation not equal 0, we can simply subtract c on both sides, and that will remedy that situation. Once we meet these prerequisites, then we're going to take half of the middle term b and square it. Whatever number we get, we'll add this number to both sides. On the left, we'll end up with a perfect square trinomial, and then we'll be ready to solve the equation using the square root method. This is kind of a lot, so let's take a look at the example and try to make sense of it. Here's our first example. We are given a quadratic equation, and I am going to note my a equals 1. So that prerequisite is met. In case you don't see it, there's a 1 right here. We don't show it when the leading coefficient's 1, so that's good. However, the second condition, ax squared plus bx, sorry, having technical difficulties, plus c cannot equal 0. Notice this equation equals 0. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 4 to both sides. When I add 4 to both sides, my conditions are met. So this is going to give me x squared minus 4x equals 4. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is take half of the middle term. The middle term, I'm calling this b right here. Take half of b and square it. Okay, so let's see what that looks like. This is side work. Take half of b, that means divided by 2, and square it. This gives me negative 2 squared. This gives me 4. Now the next step is to add this 4 to both sides. So I will have x squared minus 4x equals 4, and then I'll add 4 and add 4. When I do this, on the left-hand side, that's right here, we're going to have what's called a perfect square trinomial. Let's note the right-hand side just equals 8. The left-hand side is a perfect square trinomial, which I can write as x minus 2 squared. Now, for those of you who don't remember, this negative 2 comes from this negative 2. So whatever number's in this box right here will always end up as the perfect square trinomial. Now I can solve this using the square root method. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides, which, remember, we have to do this. When I take the square root of both sides, I will have x minus 2 equals, do not forget the plus or minus square root of 8. And now I need to get x by itself, so I'll add 2 to both sides. When I add 2 to both sides, this will give me, oh, this horrible x. X equals 2 plus or minus the square root of 8. And I'm going to remind you that the square root of 8 can be simplified because 8 is really 4 times 2. And when I take the square root of 4, that gives me 2. And then I'll have square root 2 right here. This is my final answer. Okay, hopefully those steps make more sense now, and I'll walk you through a few more examples. For this example here, I'm just going to make my note again. I'm going to say note A equals 1, so that's good. I'm comfortable there. But my equation does not equal 0. In other words, I need ax squared plus bx minus c, plus c does not equal 0. That's okay because I can simply subtract 1 on both sides. Now I will have x squared minus 6x equals -1. Okay, now I'm going to take half of the middle term, which is my b term. This is going to be -6. Take half means divide by 2 and square it. This gives me -3 and square it, which gives me +9. I'm going to add this 9 to both sides. X squared minus 6x plus 9 equals -1 plus 9. Okay. Now I am going to note on the left I have a perfect squared trinomial. So this is going to give me x minus 3 squared equals 8. Now I'm going to use the square root property to solve this. So I'm going to take the square root of both sides. X minus 3 equals plus or minus the square root of 8. Now I'm going to add 3 to both sides. X equals 3 plus or minus, and I'm going to reduce the square root of 8, and that's going to give me 2 square root 2. So we see there's quite a few steps, but not too overwhelming. We can definitely do this. Let's take a look at another example. Here, my a equals 1, so I can note that. But notice my equation's in the improper form. In other words, my ax squared plus bx does not equal the constant -c. So in this case, what I'm going to do is subtract over the 2x. I'm going to subtract 2x on both sides. When I do this, I will have x squared minus 2x equals -15. Okay, now I have enough. Now I have the proper form, so I can continue with my steps. Step 1. Take half of the middle term. That means divide the b by 2 and square it. This is going to give me -1, and I'm going to square it. When I square it, I'll get 1. And now I have to add this 1 to both sides. This is x squared minus 2x. I'll do a plus 1 equals -15 plus 1. On the left, I have a perfect square trinomial. This is going to give me x minus 1 quantity squared equals -14. Now I'm going to solve using the square root property. This is going to give me x minus 1 equals plus or minus the square root of -14. I'm going to get x by itself by adding 1 to both sides, plus or minus. Remember, when you have a negative under the square root, that becomes I. So this is I square root 14. This is my final answer. Alright, here's our next example. And in this example, note my a equals 1, so that's good. But I don't have ax squared plus bx plus c not equal 0. So what I'm going to do is add 6 to both sides. This gives me x squared plus x equals 6. Okay, now I'm going to continue by taking half of the middle term and squaring it. Notice there's a 1 right here. We don't see it, but we know there's a 1 there. So when I take half of 1, that gives me 1/2. Hold on, my pen's not working right. This gives me 1/2, and I have to square it, which gives me 1/4. Now the technique says add this number to both sides. So I'm going to have x squared plus x plus, hold on, my pen is skipping, plus 1/4 equals 6 plus 1/4. Alright, don't let the fractions throw you off here. On the right hand side, that's going to be 6 over 1. I need to get common denominators. The common denominator is going to be 4. So I'm going to multiply this by 4 and multiply this by 4. When I do that, this is going to give me 24 over 4 plus 1 over 4. And then I know I'm going to add the numerators, keep the denominator, and that's going to give me 25/4. Now let me work on the left-hand side. On the left-hand side, I have a perfect square trinomial, and this is going to give me x plus 1/2 quantity squared. Then I'm going to take the square root of both sides because I want to solve with the square root method. This is going to give me x plus 1/2 equals plus or minus the square root of 25 over 4. Now to get x by itself, I'm going to subtract 1/2 on both sides. X equals negative 1/2 plus or minus 5 over 2. I took the square root of 25 and the square root of 4. This gives me 5/2. So what's going to happen now is I'm going to have two solutions. I'm going to have negative 1/2 plus 5/2, and I will have negative 1/2 minus 5/2. For negative 1/2 plus 5/2, that gives me 4 4/2, which gives me 2. That's one solution. And negative 1 minus 5 gives me, oops, I don't know how I got 5 over 6. That should be 5/2. Excuse me. Negative 1 minus 5 gives me negative 6 over 2, which gives me negative 3. Those are my two solutions. Okay, now I just have one more example I just want to share with you. I'm not going to complete the whole example, but we haven't talked about an equation when the a is not 1. Let's take a look here. Suppose I want to solve negative 2x squared plus 16x equals negative 12. I'm going to say note a does not equal 1. So in order to fix this, I need to divide the entire equation by a so that it becomes 1. In other words, I'm going to divide this by negative 2, divide this by negative 2, and divide this by negative 2. This is going to give me x squared minus 8x equals 6. Now my a equals 1, and I can continue with the steps. I am going to let you solve this one, and just note your final answer should be x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 22. After you watch this video, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. Thank you.